What's going on, everyone? It's Danny Haiphong here, joining you for an impromptu stream. I want to talk about the reactions to the Ukraine situation, the ongoing developments with regard to Ukraine, and especially the so-called progressive reaction. And namely, the most stark example of this really troubling reaction was Kyle Kalinske. But really, immediately yesterday, as reports in the corporate media were coming out that Vladimir Putin had given a speech where he declared the uh, autonomous republics of the Donetsk region independent, there was a firestorm of reactions that Russia had invaded Ukraine, that Ukraine its sovereignty was being violated by Russia. And here it is. War is here. World War III is here. That was trending a lot throughout the day. Please let me know how I sound. How do I sound, everyone? How do I sound? Just put it in the chat. But I want to talk about a few things, and I'm going to be really cognizant of time because I do have to uh, go kind of strictly within an hour, hour and 15 minutes. So while you're here, like the stream, of course, please like the stream. Please subscribe if you have not subscribed to the channel. And please do. I am working towards about 410 subscribers on Patreon. I'm trying to reach that goal before the end of the month. Please do support the work that I do, weekly columns, regular streams like this, and a lot more at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. You also get a nice PDF copy of my 2019 book on American exceptionalism. And oh my, is American exceptionalism relevant here? It seems like history doesn't really matter when it comes to this issue of Ukraine when the corporate media spits out headlines that are meant to generate fear, that are meant to bring us to a place where we're born yesterday, right? I call them born yesterday progressives, born yesterday leftists. They don't really care about the context. They don't care about the ongoing situation that has been so devastating for so many people in that region, Russia and Ukraine included, for decades, but especially since 2014. But we're going to get into that. So, the principal issue here, guys, is first of all, we are, if we are truly leftists, if we are anti imperialist, we need to, number one, oppose US meddling. And this issue, this latest, how long has it been? More than a month now that the United States, the Biden administration, has been claiming that there's some kind of invasion that's going to happen. It's almost every day now that Russia is supposed to invade Ukraine. And how many people have really been on the left, really been saying that we need to oppose US meddling? Not many. Generally the same kinds of folks, people like myself, socialist organizations, anti-imperialist organizations. But in terms of the broader left, not so much. We haven't gotten that. And that is troubling because what that speaks to is this new Cold War moment where new Cold War propaganda is indeed the driving force for how we understand this issue. And it is a huge and utter problem. It is a problem. It is a mistake. And we need to expose this propaganda for what it is. Now, yesterday, Vladimir Putin did give a speech, and I don't agree with everything in his speech. He said a lot of things about the Soviet Union I would not really agree with. He didn't, he basically essentially opposed Lenin's doctrine of self-determination for oppressed nations and said that the Soviet Union was practicing ethno-nationalism. I do not believe that was the case. Actually, the situation was the Soviet Union actually helped defeat Nazis in Ukraine, a whole lot of Nazis in Ukraine. And were it not for that, Ukraine would likely have been under Nazi rule for a lot longer than it has been as of late. And that's what you don't hear, right? You don't hear that actually Ukraine has been under a coup government, a far right coup government that the United States supports heavily, deeply. Hundreds of millions of dollars in the last year alone have gone to the Ukraine coup government to militarize that regime and to try to separate Ukraine from Russia and ultimately bring Ukraine into the warm embrace of NATO. That's what is at the root here. And there are too few people willing to say that on the left because they have Russia, 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 anti-Russia hysteria on their minds. So yesterday, Kyle Kalinske came out with a video saying Russia invaded, and I could not believe it because there were other folks on the left who were also saying, "Oh, well, this is it. Russian imperialism is here, and we are ultimately now at the brink of war," as if the United States hadn't already been waging war in Ukraine for more than 7 years now, longer than 7 years. And we're going to get into what I mean by longer than 7 years. The United States has been meddling in Ukraine for decades to try to bring it into the fold of NATO. And for the last 30 plus years, NATO has been encroaching upon Russia's borders. That is what really is at the heart of all of this. And the late Stephen Cohen was so prolific in this regard in that he was able to be one of the few scholars, few journalists who actually talked about this in the mainstream arena and had a platform to do so. And right now, we don't have a voice like that really in the mainstream. And on the left, we have people far to the right of Stephen Cohen talking about how Russia is invading, it's not even true. So the fact that Kyle Kalinske or anybody could be insinuating this without looking at the facts, first of all, I think is just condemnable. It's abhorrent. And it literally is the opposite of helpful. What it does is it continues to fuel this new Cold War anxiety based on Russophobia, based on racism, based on new Cold War propaganda and this larger agenda of empire that obscures completely the roots of the crisis. So we have to be very vigilant against this. We have to continuously call it out, and we cannot be afraid to say the truth and speak the truth that Russia is not the problem here. It's not Russia that is militarizing the region of Eurasia. It's not Russia that is trying to impose NATO rule upon Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, etc. It is not Russia that is dropping bombs on countries around the world and waging regime change in all continents. That's not the problem. Russia is not the problem here. The problem is that the United States sees Ukraine as a flashpoint for its larger imperialist agenda, and it has been successful in diverting people's attention, diverting the left's attention to the Russian boogeyman, to make Vladimir Putin, to make Russia out to be an equal, if not more so, threat to justice, to peace, than even the United States itself. And this is really a key part of this new Cold War. So, with that said, you're here. Please do like the stream. Please do subscribe if you have not. And please do, if you are able to, please do subscribe to Patreon at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. Support my journalism, support my work. I have a goal within the next week, 6 days or so before the end of February to reach 410 subscribers. I am going to continue to do this work, continue to call out the BS, continue to be principled about it, though, because there is a lot, as you know, on Twitter, people get kind of crazy in social media, and it's all public forum, and it's all about who can denigrate and who can kind of own who. But for me, this is about the struggle for peace. This is about anti-imperialism. This is about the larger struggle for a world where we are free from imperialism. And the only way we can become free from imperialism is we have to actually attack imperialism head on. We need to fight imperialism head on. And to just so willfully go along with new Cold War propaganda, funneled by the corporate media, funneled by the military industrial complex, funneled by NATO, funneled by the US ruling class, is to commit the ultimate betrayal of anything that could be called a left movement, which right now is not in such great shape. So let's talk a bit about the roots of this crisis. Okay. What has happened in Ukraine over the last several decades? Well, Ukraine falls within a larger regional context where the United States has used NATO to accelerate its hegemony, to accelerate its dominance over the region. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was pulverized. Its economy was a complete and utter basket case. It was a disaster. It was in a complete collapse. In the United States, in Europe, and the Western powers facilitated the most brutal form of shock therapy, they called it, austerity, to literally destroy every vestige of socialism, state ownership, of any protections for the people. And the standard of living for people in Russia, the newfound Russian Federation, after the breakup of all of the Soviet republics, the standard of living in that country fell to such a huge degree that I don't think we have seen in the modern era life expectancy for men and women go down to the degree that it did. I think it was something like 10 to 15 full year decrease over the course of the decade after the Soviet Union fell. So that was the situation. Russia was now no longer a power in any sense of the word in 1991. In the United States, of course, as you may know, use the post-Soviet period from 91 till it declared the global war on terror in 2001 to cement its hegemony every single corner of the planet. And that includes Eastern Europe, that includes the 1999 NATO invasion and bombing of Yugoslavia. It includes invasions of Somalia, and it includes the devastation that was wrought upon the Middle East and Iraq in particular, even before the global war on terror with sanctions. So, all of this must be included into the conversation. The US has been on an imperialist war drive on steroids since the end of the Soviet Union, and now is in a position where it has been successful in, for example, Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic states, in recruiting them into NATO by literal by force, really, by creating an economic and political situation that basically allowed for that to happen. And so what has occurred is that now Russia is surrounded by NATO. And that's after this handshake agreement between Gorbachev and the United States before the Soviet Union fell. And unfortunately, Gorbachev was a huge part of that. There was a handshake agreement that uh, east of East Germany, NATO would not expand, but expand it has. And the United States has not abided by that handshake agreement. And honestly, even if it was on paper a signed the United States does not obey, does not follow through on any kind of agreements because the United States is a unipolar imperialist hegemon. And the only interests that it abides by are the interests of capital, the interests of the military industrial complex. So Russia, right, has entered a period post 2001, 2002 under Vladimir Putin, where it has tried to reemerge as a stable state, a state that can be a player on the world stage, that can assert sovereignty and independence and self-determination. It has been quite successful to the point now where it is an economic competitor to some degree, much smaller than China, and still a capitalist country, but has the capacity to assert self-determination and sovereignty and to be a different pole, to represent a different pole from the United States in that region. And that has angered the United States greatly that Russia would even begin to think that it could act independently of US diktats. And so the United States, especially since the Obama administration came to power and it began its pivot to Asia, it really began this great power competition strategy, which was then named that under Trump. But really, beginning under Obama, where the war on terror, the global war on terror, was coming to a close, the United States saw China and Russia as the biggest threats to US hegemony, especially after, we have to understand this, the United States had entered into quagmire after crisis, after disaster in its so-called global war on terror, culminating in this botched invasion of Libya, which destroyed so many lives, had a black president bombing an African country, creating a refugee crisis unseen in human history. And the United States couldn't maintain stability anywhere at that point, right? Libya, Syria, all of these interventions were not bringing the kind of fruits that the United States was hoping for. And so it necessitated this geopolitical shift to the point now where we're having the Atlantic Council Foreign Policy magazine announce that Russia and China need to be attacked. They need to be targeted for war simultaneously, because we're now at this point of desperation in the US's imperialist agenda where that is becoming a necessity. So that is some of the bigger context. And I'm going to go over a really good article later by Jenny Clegg, a good comrade out in the UK, who wrote an article for Multipolarista, Ben Norton's outlet, and we shared it at Friends of Socialist China about this new Cold War that really peppers this larger context to the Ukraine situation, one that's not being talked about. So that's what part of the stream is about. It's not just to say, Kyle Kulinski, you're wrong for saying Russia invaded Ukraine, because he was, and a lot of these leftists who are saying, oh, this is imperialism, they're all wrong because they don't know the definition of imperialism. Imperialism isn't recognizing these autonomous republics that broke off from the Ukraine because of this disgusting and gross far-right instigated civil war that the United States backed, right? There was someone in the chat who said that the republics in Donetsk voted to be part of Russia in 2014, and that's true. That happened amid the Crimea referendum. There were multiple referendums happening because the country was breaking apart, because the Maidan Revolution was not a revolution for socialists. It wasn't a revolution for economic liberation or political liberation for oppressed people. It was a revolution to make Ukraine a vassal state to empire, to take it completely out of the orbit of multipolarity. That's where Yanukovych was moving to at the time, 2013, 14, moving more toward Russia, despite having still deep relationships with the West. And the whole Maidan Revolution, the whole backing of it, funneling all this money, these resources, this PR to them, it was all about putting Ukraine into a situation where it no longer was part of the Russian multipolar, Russia-China multipolar order. And it was about laying the basis for this future NATO membership, which, because of the PR disaster, is still on hold, but that's the ultimate goal. So we have to understand that broader context. We can't, it is true. Much of the left has this wrong. Imperialism is an economic and political system of domination by monopoly and finance capital driven by endless war. That's not what Russia has. Russia is not big enough to be that economically. It's not in that stage of its own development. It probably will never get there, given that it had the Soviet experience prior to the disastrous collapse into capitalism. And we also know that the world situation is so complicated at this point, given the US's economic state, given how monopoly capital and finance capital and the war machine, they are all in such a delicate yet extremely overinflated state, that it's unlikely that Russia is going to be able to, even if there were forces who want this, which I'm sure that there are in Russia among certain sections of the oligarchy, it's unclear whether that can happen given the shift in the overall development of forces. We have to think about this stuff dialectically. We can't think about this as Russia bad because Putin bad, because Russia's capitalist, because Russia is not the socialist utopia. No, we have to look at this dialectically. Russia is not acting as a singular force. Russia falls within this global array of forces that are in struggle right now. And Russia right now occupies this position of peace. Few people on the left will talk about how Russia's so-called demands, which the corporate media has called them, really just requests, have all just been about ceasing military escalation. It's about ceasing this ongoing drive to threaten war with Russia along its borders. That's what a lot of it was about. Stop sending money, stop sending military weaponry, stop talking about NATO membership, throw that out. Stop putting your bases and your weapons right here, targeted, pointing at us. Really reasonable things, but no, Russia is making demands, right? This is all spun in a certain way to make Russia look like the imperialist force, when in fact, the United States has a broad agenda that it refuses to acknowledge. So while you're here, please do like the stream. Please do subscribe if you have not subscribed yet. I am trying to obtain, my goal for this month is 410 Patreon subscribers. I'm about 5 away. So if you can support the show, please do. Patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. And now I'm going to continue. I want to share an article in the Jacobin of all places. And Aaron Mate shared this. And so I wanted to share this article and just read a few segments of it that get into this larger context, right? The US's role in instigating this crisis. We have to talk about it like this. It's not Russia instigating, it's not Russia's going to invade. It is the US has an agenda that it is seeking to fulfill in the Ukraine with regard to Russia. It is seeking to use Ukraine and exploit Ukraine as a chess piece. Part of this chess piece is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It is the economic war, and it's working. There are rumors that the pipeline will not continue. So, it's already been constructed, but there are rumblings that it will never go into operation because Germany will side with the United States. So this is huge, right? This is all very important. So let me share this Jacobin article real quick because I want to read this section on democracy promotion. Can you see all? Let me see. I just need to go back. All right. So there it is. So if you all can see that, I might make it a little bigger. Let me see if I can do that. So I want to talk about this section here. It is called, here we go, free market democracy promotion, because this is a really important point. During the so-called Maidan Revolution, there was all these fact checkers from the mainstream media who were saying PolitiFact and Snopes and all of that. They're saying, oh, well, everyone's saying that the United States was funding the protesters, and that wasn't true. That's a big, big lie. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And here we go. So there's a critical piece to the Euromaidan puzzle, the role of Western governments. Oh, and by the way, this article, it's really good. It's the Jacobin, so there's issues in it, but Branko Marcetic, this is a good article called "A U.S.-backed far-right-led revolution in Ukraine helped bring us to the brink of war." It's a recent article, February 7th, so I found it helpful. I'm not going to read it all for you now because of this deadline. I'm actually going to be off of here probably 3:15, 3:30, so I'm just going to fast forward a bit. You can read the whole article in Jacobin, but as I said before, the role of Western governments, a critical piece to this puzzle. For decades, Washington and allied governments have pursued their strategic and economic interests under the cover of promoting democracy and liberal values abroad. Sometimes that means funneling money to violent reactionaries like the Nicaraguan Contras, and sometimes it means supporting benign pro-democracy movement like those in Ukraine. Okay, I want to call them benign. That's not a good term to use, but nonetheless, this is very true that the United States has done this in so many places. Hong Kong recently, 2019, 2012, 14, also in Hong Kong. We can go down the line constantly, right? Bolivia helped foment the 2019 coup with this money being funneled in. We now know the rest of China, they're trying to foment things there. Laos, everywhere you can think where there's a possibility that a government or a people will chart their own destiny, Cuba, etc., there will be NED money flowing either into those countries or into forces outside of those countries seeking to destabilize them, seeking to destabilize these efforts. So external actors have always played an important role in shaping and supporting civil society in Ukraine, says Ukrainian scholar Erna Selenenko, who wrote this in 2015, pointing to the EU and the United States through agencies like the NED and the US Agency for International Development, who our good friend Samantha Powers is now head of under Joe Biden, and whose Kiev headquarters were in the same compound as the US Embassy. Very convenient. One can argue without external support, which has been a major source of funding for Ukrainian civil society since independence, that it would not become what it is now. And so this was the case in the 2004-5 Orange Revolution, which actually also overthrew Yanukovych too. He actually had to go into political exile for a little while, and then he ran again, and he became one of the more trusted politicians in Ukraine. But so foreign NGOs changed little about Ukraine's corruption and authoritarianism, but achieved a crucial goal of nudging Ukraine's foreign policy westward. As a liberal center for American liberal center for American progress, I think we want to call that more neocon center for American progress. So anyway, again, there are problems with this, but did Americans meddle in the internal affairs of Ukraine? Yes. The American agents of influence would prefer a different language to describe their activities: democratic assistance, democracy promotion, civil society support, etc. But their work, however labeled, seeks to influence political change in Ukraine. So even from the Center for American Progress, which is a neoliberal, neoconservative leaning think tank, has admitted that there was US meddling in Ukraine, but yet the left can't admit that. US officials unhappy with the scuttled EU deal saw a similar chance in the Maidan protests. So Yanukovych, 2013, leading into the 2014 unrest, had decided that he was not going to admit Ukraine or put Ukraine on a pipeline to NATO, and was going to actually keep relations between Russia and the EU more balanced rather than go all in with the EU, which would mean the IMF and all of that. So there's a lot of concern in Ukraine about privatization, which has happened since the coup. But there was concerns among Yanukovych and his section of the Ukrainian elite that would cause political issues, which it has. That's exactly what's happened. So just 2 months before they broke out, the NED's then president, pointing to Yanukovych's European outreach, wrote that, quote, "The opportunities are considerable and there are important ways Washington could help," end quote. In practice, this meant funding groups like New Citizen, which the Financial Times reported, quote, played a big role in getting the protests up and running, led by a pro-EU opposition figure. Journalist Mark Ames, really cool. We follow each other on Twitter. Really like his work at Radio War Nerd. Discovered the organization had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from U.S. democracy promotion activities. So there you go. While it may be a long time before we know its full extent, Washington took an even more direct role once the turmoil started. You remember this, guys? John McCain, Chris Murphy met with Svoboda's fascist leader, standing shoulder to shoulder with him as they announced their support to the protesters. Well, this is the great one. Victoria Nuland, Secretary of State, Assistant to the Secretary of State, was handing out sandwiches and cookies to the protests. To understand the provocative nature of such moves, you only need to remember the establishment outrage over the mere idea Moscow had troll farms to voice support for Black Lives Matter protests. So later, a leaked phone call showed Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine maneuvering to shape the post-Maidan government. Fuck the EU, Nuland told him, over its less aggressive intervention into the country. Yats is the guy who got economic experience, she said, referring to the opposition leader, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who backed the devastating neoliberal policies demanded by the West. You can probably guess who became prime minister in the post-Maidan interim government. That was him. It's an overstatement to say, as some critics have charged, that Washington orchestrated the Maidan uprising, but there's no doubt U.S. officials backed and exploited it for their own ends. So that's a political deviation. That's why I'm not a big fan of the Jacobin a lot, because I think when you have that level of involvement and you're the imperialist hegemon, that means that even if it's not a direct manipulation, that indirect covert soft power is actually achieving the same ends as, let's say, U.S. troops on the ground, literally strong arming a government to do what it wants, or strong arming a movement to do what it wants. I don't see the point of saying that, but here you go. It's the Jacobin after all, but it's still really good information that shows you all of the ways in which the U.S. was involved, even in just that moment, right? From the NED funding to these key groups, to the fact that U.S. officials like Victoria Nuland, like John McCain, were literally on the ground, handing out cookies, hobnobbing, rubbing shoulders with Nazis in order to overthrow the government. So here we go. Let's keep going. Revolution unfulfilled. Much as in 2004 Orange Revolution, the outcome of the Maidan Revolution, though no fault of the majority of well-meaning, frustrated Ukrainians who helped drive Yanukovych out. Here you go. Let's pretend we didn't read that, but we did, and it just shows some of the ridiculousness of this. But was neither peace, instability, nor move toward liberal values and democracy. And in fact, most of the protesters' demands have gone unfulfilled. Well, of course, because I don't actually believe there were many legitimate demands there. But here we go. The same, we have to talk about power, and unfortunately, Jacobin has some issues with that. But this is part of the left's problem, right? At least what calls itself the left. The same far right that had led the charge in toppling Yanukovych, including Perubi, found themselves with plum roles in the interim government that followed, with the winner of the 2014 snap presidential election, Petro Poroshenko, its seventh richest man, had a history of corruption. His interior minister soon incorporated the Azov regiment, the Azov battalion, which is a neo-Nazi militia, into Ukraine's National Guard, with the country now a mecca for far-right extremists around the world who come to learn and get training from Azov, including, ironically, Russian white supremacists who were hounded from their country by Vladimir Putin. So there you go. Putin's supposed to be this big fascist, awful racist, but he's anti-fascist, and a lot of these fascists ended up joining the Azov battalion. Now, I don't know if you remember also during the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, the Azov battalion also went to Hong Kong to express their solidarity with those far-right protesters. So this far-right movement backed by the United States is global in character, and it ranges from the official Jair Bolsonaro regimes in Hungary, Poland, to also these more grassroots forces. I don't even want to call them grassroots, but to these more paramilitary forces like Azov Battalion. So despite far-right parties ultimately losing seats in parliament, ultranationalist movements successfully shifted the country's politics to the extreme right, with Poroshenko and other centrists backing measures to marginalize the speaking of Russian and glorify Nazi collaborators. Even so, far-right candidates have entered parliament on non-far-right tickets, and extremists like former Azov commander Andriy Belitsky have taken high-ranking law enforcement positions. While far-right vigilantism spread throughout the country, Poroshenko himself granted citizenship to a Belarusian neo-Nazi and engaged in some borderline anti-Semitism of his own. Little to nothing has changed about Ukrainian corruption or authoritarianism under either Poroshenko or either Volodymyr Zelensky, elected in 2019 as an outsider agent, but he's turned out to be a real puppet torn apart, really. So each has governed like an autocrat, using their powers to go after political opponents, weaken dissent, and have blah, 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 blah. So Ukraine, it says it's been embattled in a mini civil war, and that. I don't like to put it in those terms. So, you know, what happened in 2014 and 15, and let's just actually end this screen share. Okay. So we're done with that article, and we'll go on to Jenny Clegg's article in a few minutes. But the point here is that the U.S. is heavily involved in Ukraine, from the soft power funneling of money to these so-called civil society groups, to giving political cover for neo-Nazis and fascists that dominate the parliament in Kiev. And this has to be part of the narrative. And it's not. But Stephen Cohen, even NBC, even mainstream, I was looking through research today, a lot of mainstream media actually acknowledge this to some degree, because how can you not when it's at just the material reality on the ground? But now, in this moment of, oh, the Russia is invading, you saw Mr. Engel over at NBC literally do a whole segment covering the Azov battalion, covering the fascist paramilitary groups who were training grandmas and others. and not talking about how they were fascists, right? This is the level of discourse right now in the corporate media, the military industrial complex wing of the media, but even among leftists like Kyle Klinsky and others, so-called leftists, people who consider themselves independent, they just swallow the same narrative. They don't prioritize this. You need to prioritize the fact that your government is supporting Nazis, neo-Nazis, and fascists in Ukraine. If you don't do that, then what are you doing? Why even talk about this? Maybe just stay in your lane. Let others have the space and opportunity to bring to a more mass audience the truth about these issues. But we don't you generally have that. I focus more on China. We'll get to Jenny Clegg's analysis of how Ukraine is not just about Russia, but also about China and this overall new Cold War, which includes both Russia and China. You don't have a lot of that room opened up because, well, the new Cold War propaganda has worked in a lot of ways. People do have really, I mean, I think it's like somewhere in the 70 percentile range of negative opinion toward Russia. China, it's even worse, somewhere in the 80% range, where people have a negative view of China. So the new Cold War, when the military aspect of it and the propaganda aspect of it is so dominant, it has had a real effect on the American public's consciousness. So that's why it's so critical that we bring in this context, that we bring in the fact that the United States is involved in Ukraine, is militarizing Ukraine, giving Ukrainians military lethal aid, right? Calling it lethal aid, which indicates that it will be used for war. And the fact that, let's just go over really quick, and this doesn't even take much explanation, but Donetsk, Donbass, the republics, the breakaway republics, they've been under heavy assault. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced. Thousands of people have died in this so-called civil war, which is really all about this far-right government attacking the eastern section of the country, which does not want any part of this far-right regime. It doesn't want any part of being completely cut off from Russia. It doesn't want any part of this anti-Semitic, anti-Russian agenda of the government in Ukraine, and it doesn't want any part of NATO. And that is why there is all of this controversy about Putin recognizing these breakaway republics. It's not because of concern for Ukraine, it's because the United States wants to see this so-called civil war reach the conclusion that it wants, which is the complete pummeling of the entire the entire country, right? The complete overthrow and overtaking of the entire country so that it can firmly sit in the US's camp. But Ukraine is divided now. And Vladimir Putin's message that he supports these breakaway republics and their autonomy and independence is a political move based on reality. It's based on the fact that they've already been treated as such by Ukraine's government, and now the danger is as such, where it necessitates real political support from Russia even further than what's already been going on, because Russia has been supporting these uh, breakaway republics, and rightfully so. They're Russian-speaking people. They identify in a lot of ways as Russian. This is the legacy of the Soviet experience. This is the legacy of the region, the history, and it's just it just completely blows my mind that people who don't understand and don't know would comment on this, right? So someone in the chat said, will this be posted in its entirety? Yes, it will be. It always is. So please do like the stream as I take a little pause, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, and also subscribe to the show and support it on Patreon at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. I'm about 5 subscribers away from my goal of 410 before the end of this month. And I would really be grateful if you could help me do that. Support the weekly streams, or they're not weekly, but they're regular, and they're getting to be more weekly and regular. Supporting that, all the work I'm doing, producing, cutting this up, and also support my weekly columns, which is really the majority of the work that I do. You get a little PDF copy of my 2019 book in there, and I put all my work there. And so you can support this anti-imperialist journalism there, and I would really be grateful if you could. So We're going to move on, though, because I want to get into the broader agenda. Because, I talk a lot about China, but it's not because of just China. It's because of this world situation that Ukraine falls under. So we have to understand how the saber rattling over Ukraine, this Russian invasion madness, is not just about Ukraine. It's about this global situation, this empire that is so desperate to maintain its hegemony and that understands that its system is unraveling, that its imperialist system is unraveling, that monopoly capital is unraveling, finance capital, the rule of the rich, is becoming untenable, that people, the misery, the illegitimacy of it all is reaching this breaking point where the world is trying to move in a different direction, this multipolar direction. And we have to understand that, especially in the belly, in the heart of the empire, where we can't even organize our own workers toward movements that are progressive and leftist in character. We have some workers doing some things about COVID or something like that, but we don't even have a labor movement or a socialist movement and a working class movement right now that's powerful enough to say, okay, we need healthcare jobs, we need student debt forgiveness, we need all of these things, Medicare for all of that. And we also need to roll back the war machine. We need to ensure that these trillions of dollars are not going to the war machine to kill workers abroad. That is what we need because these issues are completely and totally related. But it's this foreign policy question, this question of peace, anti-imperialism, which really is a barrier, right? Because of the new Cold War thinking, because the United States is, right? If the US is funding far right white supremacists and Nazis in the Ukraine, guess where that comes from? That comes from the United States' own history, right? There's a deep bond, right? And Hitler said it himself. I don't know if you all remember this, but Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf. I've only read passages and I've read work on this, but he was very inspired by the US's genocide of the indigenous people, by race-based immigration laws that excluded, for example, Chinese immigrants, that excluded Eastern European immigrants, Jews, etc., from coming to the United States based on their race. He was very inspired by all of this. He was inspired by the US's racial project, its racist empire. And Nazism has very deep roots in the United States. So we need to not deny that because it can be easy when there is such a rightward shift and drift. And it just seems like there's a lot of silence about this. So we can't be silent about that because that also is part of this context. The new Cold War propaganda wouldn't work as well if it wasn't based in this deep white nationalist, imperialist, chauvinist US superiority complex. It would not work as well because if there weren't so many people who were willing to say, yeah, not only are we superior, but we want to be superior and we will sit atop the head, we want to sit atop a throne of Chinese skulls, which is what Tucker Carlson's guest, I forget his name now, he's some far right flunky, but Tucker Carlson just nodded along, right? If that can be the case and you have millions upon millions upon millions of people ready to support that, well, it means your society is rooted in white supremacy as well. So let's get to Jenny Clegg's article because I love this piece. She is a good comrade. And so I wanted to just give her some air because it goes over some critical context. So again, as I'm sharing this, please like the stream. Please do subscribe to the channel. And if you are able to help me reach my goal of 410 Patreon subscribers before the end of this month, you can subscribe in the description, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. So where is this article? Here we go. Okay. So Ukraine crisis is part of new Cold War on Russia and China. The U.S. manufacturer crisis in Ukraine is part of the NATO drive to subordinate Europe to prevent its tilt toward the China-Russia partnership and the Eurasian powers' attempt to build a new multipolar world. Bingo, bingo, bingo. So as Russia has maintained its stand against NATO expansion, the United States, it seems, is prepared to escalate the situation to the brink of war. Why is Washington choosing to stoke a conflict with Russia when it is declared China the greatest strategic rival? To grasp the full significance of this moment of crisis over Ukraine, it has to be understood in the wider global context. Speaking for the new Cold Warriors, British Conservative Member of Parliament Tobias Ellwood raised a warning flag. Today, non Western civilizations such as China and Russia are starting to shake up the old world order. We are standing at the precipice of a new era in global uncertainty. If we blink now, the events of 2022 will determine how the next decade plays out. Russia must be opposed, we are told, not least because of its growing alliance with China. This indeed is more than a crisis over the future of Europe. It is about the future of the world order, but not in terms of Elwood's great power rivalry, rather in the context of a relative decline in US unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar trend. Ukraine in the Indo-Pacific, the US strategy. At this point in time, the very legitimacy of US leadership as the world's essential deterrent power against the world's so called dictators is on the line. The debacle surrounding the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan compounded the lack of consultation with European allies on the announcement of the AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the United States alliance, have raised serious doubts to the world about US reliability. Faced with the Ukraine crisis, Washington has to show that it is back, right? Biden is all about, we're back, America's back. Should it fail or be seen to back down, this would reinforce the perception of US decline. This matters not least in the Indo-Pacific. There, the US has been expanding its military reach from Obama's Asia pivot to the ramping up of freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. Biden's new multilateralism has seen the widening involvement of partners in naval exercises around China's coast and the strengthening of the Quad, a security alliance of the US, Australia, Japan, and India, which actually met within the last week. So this follows AUKUS and the US, Japan, then an Australia, Japan agreement on military cooperation. New defense deals between Japan and the UK and France may presage further NATO linkages to the Asia region. At the same time, Biden has shifted US focus toward Taiwan. Reneging on its promises to Russia not to expand NATO eastward, the Biden administration is now inching away from the one China policy, the very basis of US China diplomatic relations. What happens over Ukraine may well set precedents for these Indo Pacific developments. If the US and NATO uphold Ukraine's supposed right to choose its alliances, this may embolden demands for Taiwanese independence. Conversely, a rollback in the supply of arms and military trainers to Ukraine from outside may work against the US moves to partner Taiwan through increased arms sales and US training of the Taiwanese military. Any scale back of NATO's extra military architecture might discourage support for AUKUS's expansion, and it could lend weight to China's requirement that a South China Sea Code of Conduct with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, joint military exercises involving countries outside the region should have the prior consent of all parties to the agreement. So the new Cold War narrative. So this is all very good points by Jenny. She is saying that this world is interconnected, imperialism is interconnected, no strategy is separate here. So what's happening in Russia will affect the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific developments, the ways in which the US wants to contain China. It's all tied together. So the new Cold War narrative. Underlying Biden's new Cold War with China, identified as the main challenger, is the realization by strategists that the US cannot effectively contain the rising power on its own. Hence the effort to forge an alliance of democracies to confront the world's autocracies. While superficially multilateral in form, this remains a unipolar strategy in essence aimed at maintaining global primacy. The new Cold War narrative problematizes Russia and China as aggressive and expansionist powers to present US leadership as a solution to defend democracy in an uncertain world. What President Xi and Putin want, the argument goes, is to make the world safe for autocracy, right? Theirs is a quest to divide the world order, carving out their own spheres of influence. Both aspire, it is claimed, to restore the former glory of their empires and in doing so threaten democratic space within their respective regions and defy the rules-based international order, which we hear Antony Blinken say over and over and over again like it's a prayer. By denying Ukraine's supposed sovereign right to join NATO military influence, Russia seeks to limit NATO's influence and hence the US's role in Europe. Similarly, by insisting on its own claims in the South China Sea in contravention of the United Nations, uh, the UN clause ruling about which not all legal, that's a convention on the law of the seas, not all legal experts have agreed to it. In warning Taiwan over its assertion to be a self-governing democratic island, China endeavors not only to push the US out of the Pacific, but also displace it entirely as a unipolar global hegemon. So this is the new Cold War narrative. China and Russia, they're doing all these bad things. NATO and AUKUS are defensive alliances essential to stabilizing Europe and the Indo-Pacific, respectively. So it's a world order issue. The argument goes also that given the brutal nature of their autocracies, right? China and Russia, they're so unstable. Biden says Russia can't even move energy, and China, you hear in the mainstream media all the time, China's leadership, George Soros, all these oligarchic crab people, Jabba the Hutts, they're all saying that China is about to collapse, right? The Gordon Chang analysis. So they're trying to relieve their domestic anxieties through their aggressive nationalism. This makes them both extremely dangerous, according to NATO. So stoking their new Cold War further is the perception of U.S. weakness. This demands not diplomacy, but a show of strength. It is a logic of the NATO narrative reinforced by the media and think tanks that is raising the stakes of Ukraine so high. The US has to prove itself as a force capable of confronting the so-called dictators of the world. According to this new Cold War argument, giving ground to Russia would cripple US deterrence against Iran or North Korea, and worse, signal the green light to purported Chinese expansionism. This relentless new Cold War propaganda is in complete disregard of the facts. Russia and China are both surrounded by US military bases and US missiles. China has 400 military bases surrounding it specifically. So the US is spending 3 to 4 times what China is spending, 16 times what Russia is spending on military, on defense. And so it's obvious that they're not trying. So, I don't know if I have time to go through all of this, but it's important to also look at Europe as she does, right? Because there is this attempt to integrate Europe, right, with China and Russia, right? So the Nord Stream 2 is part of this. And there's a lot of lucrative things going on. The Eurasian Economic Union, Russia has and wants to integrate more of Europe. And there's already a deep resource exchange in terms of natural gas and energy. And then the Belt and Road Initiative wants also to integrate Europe. It's really all about getting trade and interconnectivity from these underdeveloped regions, west of China, Western China, Xinjiang, to the west of China, Central Asia, moving all the way into Europe, right? So that's the future, and that's the future that the Russia and China projects want, but internationally, what they want. But US efforts to sanction them, as she talks about, to sanction China's tech corporations, tech companies, sanctions on Russia, it's all about keeping that at bay, especially given the fact that China specifically, and even Russia militarily, are kind of advancing past the United States and what the United States is capable of. So it's important to look at all of this, right? And so I do really implore you to read the rest of the article, and I'm just going to kind of summarize it, right? Because she then goes on to talk about the US as a world revisionist power it wants to enlist Germany into this new Cold War, right? Despite accords like the Helsinki Accords, which we're supposed to keep that at bay. The same thing with Japan. Japan has become much more militarist despite its so-called peace clause in Article 9 of its constitution. It's basically out the window now as the US continues to pressure Japan to militarize against the so-called China threat. So it's a multipolar moment, right? Russia and China just released this huge joint statement, which happened during the Olympics, and it offers the alternative, the multipolar world, where we see China now openly opposing NATO expansion, and that's big. We also see Russia and China set out a world order based on indivisible security, which no state can or should ensure its own security separately from the security of the rest of the world and at the expense of the security of other states. So basically, sovereignty, respect of sovereignty, calling for demilitarization, and a concern over US plans to develop global missile defense, while demanding a complete withdrawal and end to nuclear weapons deployed abroad. So support for organizations like the G20 BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, all of these, the Russia, India, China dialogue, all of this is all about multipolarity and bringing U.S. unipolarity to an end. And it's not an offensive effort. It really is about responding to what U.S. unipolarity has wrought and to demand the right to peaceful development, the right to choose what path a society, a country wants to go in, right? That is what China and Russia are fighting for. And they're fighting it defensively from an onslaught of imperialist aggression. And that needs to be understood. That is the principal issue here. It is not I'm going to put it in the chat too, the article, because I know some folks are asking about it. It is not Russia and China aggressively trying to undermine the United States. This is about their sovereignty, and it's about a developmental model, politically and economically, which can support international law. It can support the right of nations to self-determination. And that's a progressive struggle. That is a leftist struggle. And that is one that we need to be behind fully, because it opens up more possibilities, regardless of what you think of Russia and China, whatever. You can have your misgivings. I certainly have my own opinion about Russia and China in terms of their domestic situations, but we need to get behind this effort. So we're going to just end this article, talk about the U.S. Stokes crisis to prevent Europe and Asia from shifting toward China and Russia. So it's not ranchivist nationalism in Russia and China. It's global stability that's being put at risk by the relentless drive for U.S. expansionism, imposing ideological dividing lines to establish exclusive blocs and alliances. In this trial of strength between unipolar and multipolar world, the U.S. has not only tried to counter Russia and China's demand for recognition as major powers, but also more widely to subordinate regional organization in Europe and Asia to prevent their tilt toward Russia and China initiatives. The Ukraine crisis is a crucial moment in forging a new Cold War coalition as a step toward building an anti-China consensus. With U.S. leadership credibility hanging on in the balance, Biden's international position is only as strong as its Atlantic alliance. A reluctant Europe may act as a brake on U.S. ambitions. So this is important. Thus, the Russia threat is being hugely overinflated to break what remains of European will to resist militarization. The ploy of provoking Russia into overplaying its hand has bet on Putin acting like a dictator according to whim. However, the joint Putin-Xi statement has driven attention to the wider context, forcing Western warmongers as they threaten massive sanctions, which Pelosi calls painful, right? What they're considering for Russia. And it's forcing Western warmongers to take stock of Russia's options in its strengthening relations with China. What is in contention are two conflicting world agendas. We'll close here. The U.S. new Cold War militarization on one side against a multipolar order now driven by Russia and China together, framed by the UN with sustainable development at its heart. And so ultimately what she's saying here is that Europe right now is caught in the middle. But it's caught in the middle really of the U.S.'s Satan sandwich, which is roll with us, don't roll with Russia and China, roll with us, junior partners, right? Be subordinate as you have been throughout this post-World War II era. Continue to enact this devastating austerity so that you can fuel the militarization of Europe against Russia and China and prepare for what would be an absolutely devastating war among great powers. That is the US's agenda. And while there are possibly divisions in the ruling class over this, it is quite clear that those divisions do not reach the point of policy, because if they did, we wouldn't really be in the situation that we're in right now, right? We wouldn't be in the situation where the US is threatening to do something so counterproductive, so dangerous, which is saber rattle with Russia, an attempt to mobilize the world against Russia and China militarily. That wouldn't be happening if there was intense divisions. Now, whatever divisions there are is really all about short-term interests and cannot necessarily be trusted. But we have to understand that if we're going to really and truly stop this, which should be the goal, stopping this, demanding that the US government cease its hostile activities in the region, then that means we're going to have to build a broad based movement around that. And the problem that we face in the United States in particular is that the left isn't prepared, right? And if you're in media, like myself, I write, I'm a journalist, I do it nearly weekly, and I do stuff like this, podcasting, right? If this is what we're doing, then we need to meet the moment responsibly and really express where our interests lie. And my interests lie in a more peaceful world, a world that isn't dominated and dictated by US militarism. And that means that I am compelled to throw 100% support for a multipolar world and to affirm China and Russia's leadership in that. And this means necessarily that I need to reject new Cold War propaganda outright and not just regurgitate it because there's certain segments or large segments of a broader popular audience that soak it all in and eat it up like it's a fine wine, right? That if that is who you are, right? If that is the decision you make, then really what we are seeing and what we are witnessing is opportunism at its finest hour and at its highest order. So we need to expose the opportunism, right? There are people out there, I know who they are, the Vouches, the Kaukolinskis, the so-called social democrats, the liberals, the neoliberals, the neocons. There is this universal American exceptionalist, pro-imperialist, Western chauvinist, white supremacist mentality that is more subtle than your KKKer, although they are also a problem, but more subtle than these far right figures, these so-called leftists who don't do any investigation, but decide that it's okay to make comments in order to hype up their own algorithm and ultimately build their audience. And really, the only thing that serves is to move people further to the right. So if that is surely your game, if that's what you want to do, then you are no friend of peace and you're no friend of the movement. You're no friend of anti-imperialism. You're no friend of solidarity. You are no friend of the people, working class people, and oppressed people. So for all of you, just come. Please do support the channel by liking the stream, by subscribing to the channel, and by, if you are able to, I don't do super chats. I mainly ask for monthly support and whatever small amount you can give, because this is a regular thing that I do, and I write weekly columns. So I do more of a plethora of things. So in the description, you can find patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. I'm 5 subscribers away from my goal 410 for this month. So I really greatly appreciate it if you can support. But nonetheless, I have about 10 more minutes before I got to pick up my dog from daycare. And I want to just say that, this has been a pretty great stream. A lot of people come in. That's great. And I'm glad that you could watch here. I'm glad that you find what I have to say interesting. But please do, support the show if you can at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong, because that is how this work continues. So in closing, I don't think I'm going to have time to take any real questions today, but you can start posting them. If I do feel like I have time to get to a few. But I just want to say that we need to look at this situation from the perspective of the Russia-China alliance and the broader geopolitical situation, which is really a class struggle. We need to begin to develop the analysis, the overall orientation to world affairs that isn't rooted in this extremely dogmatic, extremely reactionary sort of impetus, desire, this sort of like id to latch on to the establishment narrative because it's convenient, right? And so we're in a moment in the United States, right? A very low moment for the so called progressive left. We have midterm elections coming up, and midterm elections are going to be another sort of circus to support the Democratic Party, which is the biggest barrier to our future on the left, to a real revolutionary class struggle. But it's not the only barrier, right? So we have to look at the Democratic Party is first line of defense of the ruling class against the movement, against the class struggle, against the anti-imperialist movement. So we have to confront them first. We need to make them a priority as a class enemy. But the entire ruling class, including the far right, who oftentimes the so-called GOP and others outside and inside of that political milieu, they are also serving a fundamental role here. They are attempting to try to latch on to the so-called working class narrative and claim that conservatism and all this nonsense is the working class movement, right? You heard Trump say it during his presidency, during his campaign, and it's just nonsense, right? It's all about maneuvering people and trying to gobble up political space so that a genuinely independent left movement that is broad in its orientation, a real socialist, anti-imperialist movement can't emerge because it's just suffocated by partisan squabbling. And so we have to avoid that. And that is something that I see happen almost on every single issue. COVID-19, the Ukraine situation, China, happens on every single issue because partisanship so intensely impacts the political situation in the United States. That is how politically vapid and bankrupt the United States is that it is extremely difficult for independent voices to move beyond that. And even when independent voices do, they're going to feel the need to cater to these various ideologies and the landscape that the establishment has painted for us. And so we need to do our best to move beyond that. I mean, that's why I consider myself a communist, a Marxist Leninist. I consider myself a socialist because I've seen that the only successful movements that have ever existed in the United States and abroad have been led by forces which firmly put socialist principles, communist principles in command. This includes the successful revolutions in China, Cuba, Vietnam, etc., Soviet Union. This includes, in the domestic sense, the during the Great Depression era, right? The so-called New Deal era. It was communists who were in the lead, right? All over the world, right? If the Soviet Union didn't exist, forget about it. The New Deal wouldn't have existed. But if it weren't for the communists struggling hard to organize workers, to put pressure to bear on the establishment, including everyone's beloved FDR, there wouldn't be a New Deal. And because the socialist movement has never been strong enough to really face reaction in any sort of significant way in the United States to the point of sustained victory, well, that's where you have, for example, Jim Crow backlash, KKK backlash. That's where you have far right backlash. That's where you have Japanese internment under FDR. That's where you have this so-called American dream and golden age of capitalism, where a lot of unions and union leadership said, okay, we'll take your crumbs and we will jump on the conservative bandwagon and we won't fight the boss anymore. We'll just negotiate sweetheart deals and we will kick out all the communists and ultimately disintegrate labor militancy to the point where now the labor movement isn't really part of a political movement, so to speak, in the broad sense. It still does work and activity on the shop floors and in where it exists. It's so small now. And this also goes for the Black liberation movement and liberation movements, indigenous liberation movement, all these movements. The most influential of it was the socialist trend, right? That was what pushed the broader movement to really adopt reforms and fight for them to the death in a lot of ways, and to really change things. And it was the destruction of the socialist leadership and trend which ensured that the backlash to that would be so significant that now we have a mass black incarceration state and a mass surveillance state and a police state, which has created such a level of fear and a level of acceptance of oppression that it's tough for people to figure out how to organize against it. And so that has been the case in the so-called neoliberal era. And now we are moving into this period of crisis and decline, characterized by the US's threat of nuclear annihilation and war provocations with big powers that it sees as major competitors, and also a domestic situation that is so unstable that all we have is stagnation, endless austerity, and no real hope for the future. And so that is a real toxic soup. And we have to be willing to say that, to accept that reality so that we can begin to navigate and study and organize in a manner that seeks to undermine it and seeks to break this repressive trend. And so this is the political situation, guys, and I do have to go. But I do want to just say, while you're here, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, support my work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong for whatever monthly amount, as little as $1, as much as however much you can give. I'm about 5 subscribers away from 410, which is my goal for February. So I greatly appreciate if any number of you could help out the effort, because this is something I'm going to be regularly doing. I have some announcements before I go. I'm actually launching a podcast on callin.com. So find me at Cold War Brew. So look up the handle Cold War Brew. It's available. The app is available on Apple devices, Android devices. Download the app. Find me at Cold War Brew. I'm going to be doing a Sunday morning show. Still got to get a handle of the app. Got to do some logistical things before starting, but sometime in March, you will see a weekly, probably Sunday morning Eastern time program. So subscribe to that. Make sure that you follow me there. And I'll also be on the Vanguard podcast on YouTube Friday. I'm trying to connect with Graham Elwood as well on his channel. Deprogram podcast. If you follow them, they'll be releasing in the next week or two our episode that I did with them. So there's some good, interesting things happening. I'm doing more collaborations. I have some ideas for March as well. So I'm putting in the work, and I appreciate all of you who support me and who have come to this stream to hear my take on the overall Ukraine situation. With that said, if you haven't done it yet, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, and if you can or able, support me at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong to help sustain this journalism and help me meet my goal for 410 subscribers about by the end of the month. But of course, honestly, the more the merrier, because this is a full-time thing for me and I'm trying to put in the work. Also I'm still working part-time because it's impossible not to work and meet the cost of living in the United States given this economic crisis. But whatever you can to do support the work. I am putting in actual work, and I'm not just coming on here blowing hard onto a microphone acting like I know what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, but there are a lot of podcasters and YouTubers on here that literally never do any investigation, never study, never read. They don't talk about anything really relevant. They're just going off at the mouth about other streamers, and they act like that's political work. Sorry, not political work. That's actually just mind rot. I was hearing Brett from Revolutionary Left Radio, good friend and comrade, on another podcast, on Deprogram podcast, and he was just like, "That's just mind rot. That's just ridiculous. And unfortunately, it's attractive, but I'm not really attracted to that. I'm attracted to what's good for the people. I serve the people. Whatever you do, whatever support you give me, it just goes into all of this work to feed this work and to hopefully build and help develop this collectively. Try to mentor folks. I really try. I hope some people who know me, if you message me, I really do try to put in the work. If you're interested in doing things like this, if you're interested in developing your consciousness, your analysis, I really try to serve the people. So with that said, salute to all of you. Like the stream before you go, subscribe to the channel before you go, go to the description, go to patreon.com/DannyHaiphong, support the show, support my work before you go. With that said, salute. I gotta go pick up my dog. It was great to be with all of you. Peace out.